morning, everybody. How we doing today? Nice. Good to see y'all. I don't think my mic's on, is it? It says it's on. Do I need to grab another one somewhere? Well, it's good to see y'all. I've been out for a few weeks. It's good to go away. It's good to come home. We spent some time going to national parks, but my kids kept wanting to come back home because of the weather. There's a reason that we live here. Should I grab another mic? Yes. I don't know what I'm doing. I really don't know what I'm doing here. I just kind of show up and they tell me what to do. And so they're getting another mic. So while we're doing that, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. Welcome. My name is Scott. I get the joy of being one of the pastors here and just glad you're here hanging out with us this morning. Hey, there we go. It works. Good job, Zach. Well done. Well done, y'all. I'm impressed. Thank you so much again for joining us, whether it's your first time or 1,000th time. We are glad that you're here. And like Jericho said, we're continuing this series today about parables. And parables are stories that Jesus tells. Parables are similes or metaphors, but the cool thing about them is they're taken from everyday life. And so when you look at the parables of Jesus, it's again, parables one of his favorite ways of communicating, of teaching. When you look at the parables that he tells, he takes them out of everyday life from first century Israel. So the parables are about things like farming and losing things and finding things. They're just like things that everyone could relate with, things that everyone in first century Israel could understand. But what makes a parable really powerful is that the parables always kind of leave open-ended. That's how they kind of end. They kind of leave you thinking about your life and about your future and about the direction that you're headed. And so parables have this way of taking an everyday situation that most people can understand and kind of twisting it so that you walk away kind of thinking about who am I and who am I becoming and where am I going? And so today we're going to look at a parable that Jesus tells in Matthew chapter 18. And what's interesting about this parable is Jesus has just got done talking about how you should respond when someone hurts you or when someone wrongs you. So Jesus says, listen, when someone does something that betrays you or hurts you or wrongs you, here's, and he really walks through kind of this detailed step-by-step, here's how you should respond, here's what you should do. And so after he gets done kind of explaining, here's specifically what you should do when someone hurts or wrongs you, one of his closest followers, one of his best friends, a guy by the name of Peter, asks him a question. And here's the question that Peter asks him. Here's what Peter says. Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered, I tell you not 7 times, but 77 times. So again, remember, Jesus has just got done saying, hey, here's step by step how you should respond when someone wrongs you. And Peter's listening going, okay, that makes sense. And then he just throws in one more question. He says, okay, just so I know, Jesus, how many times should I basically let someone hurt me or betray me or wrong me and then still keep forgiving them? And so Peter's question is actually very practical. He's literally saying, God, what's the minimum that I need to do? Because sometimes you have people in your life that just keep hurting you, right? Over and over and over again. And Peter's basically saying, how long am I required to put up with that? And then he throws out this number. He says, is it 7 times? Now that number might seem a little random, but in the first century world that Peter lives in, it was generally taught by rabbis, and rabbis were Jewish experts in the law. They were the Jewish teachers. It was generally taught by rabbis that you should forgive someone 3 times. And this wasn't just an arbitrary number. I mean, rabbis had spent years, decades, centuries debating this. Right? How often should you forgive someone? And really, the rabbis, ultimately, their response is very similar to our response. I don't know if you've ever heard the saying, if you fool me once, shame on you. If you fool me twice, shame on me. We kind of have that same internal defense mechanism, right? That if you keep hurting me, I'm not going to keep having a relationship with you and forgiving you. I'm eventually going to distance myself from you. And so in some ways, that's the similar conclusion the rabbis came to. Rabbis were like, okay, listen, three times. You should forgive someone a minimum of 3 times. You could go more if you want to, but essentially that's required. So the number that Peter throws out as his suggestion of 7 is actually a really gracious number. Peter's like, well, I know the rabbis teach 3 times. I'm going to double it and add 1 for good measure. So 7, I mean, is that good? That makes me better than most people, right? I mean, we're only taught we have to do it 3 times, but I'm kind of advocating 7. What do you think about that, Jesus? And Jesus responds by saying, he says, no, not 7. But 77. Now, the number Jesus throws out, again, this is also not just a random number. It's actually a reference to Genesis 4:24. Genesis is the first book in the Bible. And in Genesis 4:24, it's this verse that is comparing the vengeance that two different guys get. And in Genesis 4:24, if you read it, says, well, this one guy, his vengeance was like sevenfold. Like what he experienced, he got back sevenfold. This other guy, his vengeance was 77-fold. And so Jesus throws out this number 77, not as a random number, but as a reference to this very familiar Old Testament passage. And kind of Jesus' point is, well, your forgiveness should at least match your desire for revenge. And the whole point here is Jesus is not advocating for a specific number of times. So don't get out your pen and paper and write, well, there's number 60, there's number 61. He's not saying, no, 77. He's just kind of throwing out this number saying, your forgiveness should match your desire for revenge. And what Jesus is ultimately articulating is he's saying, well, really, forgiveness should be unlimited. There shouldn't be a cap to it. It should be unlimited. And then he goes on to tell a parable explaining why. So the parable that Jesus tells that we're going to look at is him explaining why our forgiveness should ultimately be unlimited. So he tells a story, and here's how the story begins. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. So you have this king, he'll also be referred to as a master in this parable. You have this king, and he's got all these different people who owe him different amounts of money for different things, and he says, okay, it's time to settle accounts. It's time to pay up. So he has one guy brought before him that here, if you read this translation, it says 10,000 bags of gold. If you look, the New Testament's originally written in Greek, and if you look in Greek, the word that's used is the word talent. 10,000 talents. And a talent was like the largest denomination of money in first century Israel. The other thing that's interesting is 10,000 is essentially the largest Greek numeral. So as Jesus tells this story, he picks the two largest things you could pick. The largest numeral, the largest sum of money. So essentially what Jesus is saying here is this king, this master, brings before him a servant, and Jesus might as well have thrown in there like $1 bazillion is what he owes him. Because the amount of money he owes him is unimaginable. You can't even fathom it, which how you get in this much debt, I don't know. I mean, it says something about this guy. It says something about his life, the way he lived. It's just this unimaginable amount of debt. And so the king brings him for him and says, okay, time to pay up. I've loaned you all this money. I've given you all this money. You have an obligation to pay it back. You need to pay it back. And here's what happens next as Jesus goes on in this story. It's going to change in a second. There you go. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and children and all that they had be sold to repay the debt. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. So it's not surprising this guy can't pay off the debt. He can't, because again, he owes like $1 bazillion. And so the master does what was the normal business thing to do. Okay, everything you have, including you and your family, are going to be sold into slavery, you're going to be put in jail, so I can recuperate as much as I can get. I'm not going to get back everything, but at least this way, if I sell everything, then I'll get back something. And so that was normal business practice. That's the way things happened in first century Roman Empire. And when the king announces, the master announces what he's going to do, this man's response is to fall before him and to beg. And notice what he begs for. More time. Just give me more time. If you give me more time, I can do it. I can get the money. I can pay it off. Now the reality is, and the king knows this, no way this dude can ever pay this debt off. There's just none. It's never going to, as much time as he gives him, this guy is never going to be able to pay off this debt that he owns. Never. And so what the king does, what the master does, is he goes above and beyond the request and doesn't just grant the guy more time. He says, you know what? Forget about it. It's done. That literally what it says that the master took pity on him. The word is actually compassion. The master has compassion on him. He sees this man, he sees his situation, his heart breaks, and he says, you know what? I'm going to cancel the whole thing. Don't worry about it. You don't owe me a dime. It's done. This thing between you and I, this thing that you owe me, this debt that you owe me, it's gone. We're square. and he forgives this debt. So what's crazy about the story is the extravagant amount that the man owes is overshadowed by the extravagance of the forgiveness that the master gives him. Now, if this is where the parable ended, beautiful parable. Beautiful. If the story just ends here, it's like, here's this great story of this forgiving master, this great boss, like someone we'd all love to work for. But the thing about parables is they never end where they're supposed to. Jesus always takes a parable to a point, and you're like, oh, yay, that's such a beautiful story. And then he tacks on one more thing, and the whole thing just kind of falls apart. And so the parable doesn't end here. The parable goes on. And after this man is forgiven of his exorbitant debt, here's what he does next. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins. He grabbed him and began to choke him. Pay back what you owe me, he demanded. So this guy who's just been forgiven bazillions of dollars goes out, finds a guy that owes him 100 silver coins. Just for math, for those of us who are math teachers and engineers, the amount that this guy owes the other servant is 1/600,000th of what this guy owed the master. 1/600,000. He's just been forgiven of this exorbitant debt. He goes out, finds this guy that owes him a minuscule amount of money and begins to choke him out. The image I always get in my mind is like when I was a kid, we used to watch The Simpsons, and Homer Simpson would choke out Bart, grab him. Ah! That's the image I get, is this guy goes out and finds this guy that owes him this minuscule amount of money and just literally starts choking him out. Pay back what you owe me. You owe me this small amount. Pay back what you owe me. And we find out that this servant cannot pay back his fellow servant. And you would think that the fellow servant would respond with the same grace that he was just shown. But he doesn't. Here's what he does. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, be patient with me and I will pay it back. But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. And so his fellow servant can't pay back the small amount that he owed. And his fellow servant, interestingly enough, has the same response. He falls to his knees and begs, please, please, please give me more time. Now, the interesting thing is, in this case, this servant actually could have earned the money to pay back the debt he owed. It wasn't that extravagant of an amount. It wasn't some huge amount. It was reasonable, possible, and very likely that given more time, this guy could have earned the money to pay the debt back. So he begs, same exact thing, just give me more time, give me more time. I'll earn it, I'll pay it back, I promise. And the servant says, no. You owe me, it's time, you can't give it to me, you're going to jail until you can pay it back to me. And as Jesus is telling this story to Peter and to the other people that are there listening, and even as you and I read it, this is the part of the story that it starts to get really honestly upsetting. Because you're looking at it going, dude, you were just forgiven of this extravagant amount of money. I would expect you to go out and be just as forgiving, if not more forgiving. I would expect you to go out and be more compassionate and more loving, but you go out and you can't even forgive this guy who did so little to you. And it's almost upsetting, isn't it? But the crazy thing is that this kind of response is pretty common, not just in Jesus' world, but even in our world. Not necessarily in terms of money, but in terms of like lifestyle and behavior and morality. This kind of response happens all the time. There's a term that's used a lot in religious circles, and I'm not just referring to Christianity, I'm talking about any kind of religious tradition, and the word is legalism. And you typically someone is labeled a legalist when they put like overemphasis on things like conduct and behavior and discipline. And that you have to do this and you have to do it this way and this has to be done. And legalists don't just hold the rules to themselves, they often put them on other people. And there's a lot of guilt and shame that's put, you have to do this, you have to do that, and if you didn't do this, then you have this discipline and that discipline. And so there's a lot of people within religious traditions that are labeled as legalists, or we see them as legalists. Here's the fascinating thing about a lot of legalists. Not everyone who would be a legalist, but about a lot of legalists. What happens, and I've seen it happen all the time, and it happens all the time, is you will have people who will experience some kind of transformation in their life. Within the Christian tradition, what happens is you'll find someone who has an encounter with Jesus and their life is like just radically transformed. They have a whole new direction, they have a whole new future. But sometimes what happens in that is because of the new person they've become, they have some shame or regret about who they were. And so they look back on their past, and whether their past was like a notorious past where they did a bunch of things that they're now kind of regretting and embarrassed of, or maybe there was just one or two things, or maybe there's just one thing from our past that kind of haunts us. But there's this thing that we hold on to, and there's pain, and there's hurt, and there's shame. And so what happens is a lot of times people end up trying to prove that I'm not who I used to be. That, yeah, I used to be this person. I used to be the person that did this, or I used to be the person that made these choices, but that's not me anymore. And so the way I'm going to prove that I'm not who I used to be is in the way I live. And so I'm going to do all these new things, and I'm going to live this devout life, and I'm going to do all this, I'm going to do all that in order to prove that I'm not who I used to be. And a lot of times, the more notorious our past is, the harder we try to prove that we aren't who we used to be. And so what happens is our behavior ends up being motivated by our own shame and our own guilt. And our faith, our religion, becomes an attempt for us to prove to ourselves, to those around us, and to God that we aren't who we used to be. And so we hold on to all of these behaviors and this conduct, and we demand it of ourselves, and we demand it of other people. And what's interesting is most of the time, legalistic people, the areas in their life that they're most legalistic in are the areas in their life that they're weakest in. Because again, the legalism oftentimes isn't motivated by a desire to please God or honor God. It's motivated by a desire to prove I'm not who I used to be. And so the irony is sometimes people who have experienced the greatest transformation, people who have experienced the most grace from God, are the ones who are least likely to show it to others. Because their faith and their lifestyle and their conduct becomes a means to prove I'm not who I used to be. See, more than likely, the guy in this story, the servant in this story, who can't forgive the small amount, even though he was forgiven the extraordinary amount, more than likely his behavior is motivated by insecurity and shame and guilt. That he lived this lifestyle where he racked up this huge debt, an overwhelming debt, a debt he could never climb out of. And the master, his king, his master, forgives him. But now he's on this quest to prove I'm not that reckless, irresponsible person anymore. And so from the outside, you look at it and go, holy cow, dude, how could you do that? You were forgiven of so much, and you couldn't forgive so little. But inside, what you'll find, and again, it happens all the time, is you find us as people, like this servant, oftentimes we're motivated, and we act out of our insecurity and our shame and our guilt, and it's a desire to prove I'm not who I used to be. And so our conduct, our behavior, our legalism, motivated by shame and guilt, is a desire to prove I'm not that person anymore. I'm a new and a different person. And inside, it seems so natural and so normal to us. But outside, man, if you take an outside perspective, it is so backwards and so twisted and so destructive. See, this guy, he was forgiven of so much, but he never let that forgiveness truly change and transform him. He never let it sink in and change his reality. And it comes back to bite him. Because when he goes out and has his fellow servant thrown in jail, there's other people who see this whole thing. They witness it. And they go back to the original master, to the original king, and they tell him, hey, we got to let you know what happened. And so as Jesus goes on in this story, here's what he says next. He said, when the other servants saw what happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. You wicked servant, he said, I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. You begged me to. Right? I think it's yeah. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you? In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay back all that he owed. So the original master, the king, he hears what happens, and he's just as dumbfounded and outraged and angry as you and I are listening to this story. And he calls the servant back in. He says, dude, what is your problem? I forgave you an exorbitant amount. You couldn't forgive a little amount. So here's the deal. I'm going to treat you the same way that you treated your fellow servant. You're going into jail. And torture isn't like, the word torture there isn't like he's just going to beat him, but he's basically going to pressure him and do everything he can to get his money back. I'm going to treat you the same way that you treated your fellow servant. And this is where Jesus now gets to the point of the parable. And he's going to make it clear. And this is where he's ultimately going to answer Peter's question. And here's what Jesus says. This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart. And this is the part where it's like, ugh. Now, Jesus had said something very similar to this earlier in the book of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 6. And in Matthew 6, I think he actually says it a little bit clearer. Okay, and here's what Jesus says in Matthew 6. For if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins. And so remember, this whole parable that Jesus tells is in response to a question that Peter asks. How many times should I forgive my brother or sister when they wrong me, when they hurt me, when they betray me? And remember, Peter throws out that super generous number trying to sound super spiritual. We're only told in synagogue that we have to do it 3 times, but I doubled that and added 1 for good measure, so 7, I'm good, right? And here's Jesus' response. Jesus' response is, well, Peter, you're really free to forgive people however you want to forgive them. However you want to forgive them, however many times you want to forgive them, but just know this. The same way that you forgive people is the same way that God's going to forgive you. So, do with that what you want. Now, when we read this, sometimes it may sound like Jesus is threatening Peter. Like, Peter, if you don't forgive, God's not going to forgive you. But what Jesus is saying isn't so much a threat as it is a statement of reality. See, when you talk about forgiveness, forgiveness is a two-way street. Forgiveness has to flow to us and through us. It's not one or the other. And this is what Jesus is getting at. Jesus is saying the only way that we ever really experience forgiveness is if we forgive others. That our ability to receive forgiveness is directly tied to our ability to forgive others. See, a lot of times we want to experience forgiveness, but we withhold that forgiveness from other people. And Jesus says, this is why you never really experience forgiveness. Because it can't go just one way. It can't. It's almost like a river that has to just keep flowing through. If you can't receive forgiveness, you can't give forgiveness. But at the same time, if you can't give forgiveness, you can't receive forgiveness. See, ultimately, when you talk about forgiveness, forgiveness is really about one thing. Forgiveness is about freedom. That's what it's about. Forgiveness is about our ability to experience freedom from the painful things of our past, whether those are things that we did. Because some of us, we look back on our life and we look back on choices that we made or things that we did or things that happened to us and maybe things people did to us. We look back on our past and we have these painful moments because of things that we did or of things that others did to us. And so this is where shame and guilt and regret and pain and sorrow come from, right? All of these painful things in our past. And ultimately, if we want to experience freedom, then that requires forgiveness. And in some cases, it requires us experiencing forgiveness for what we have done. Other times, it's about us forgiving other people for what they did to us. And see, the thing about forgiveness, when you talk about forgiveness, forgiveness is actually defined as letting go of the right to get even. That's what forgiveness is defined as. Because, again, we live in this world where everything's about fairness. Right? It should be fair and there should be justice. But forgiveness acknowledges that, you know what, this thing happened, I did this thing, someone else did this thing to me. And fairness would be that I can get back at them, or fairness would be that God can get back at me, or someone else can get back at me. But forgiveness says, okay, there exists this necessity that things should be made right, but I'm going to let that go. And I'm going to let go of the need. And I'm going to let go of the desire and the want for revenge. And what makes forgiveness so powerful is also what makes it so difficult. I've shared this quote before, but this comes from Richard Beck, who is he's a psychologist, professor. He's a brilliant guy, and he wrote a book called Unclean. And it's one of the books I've read that has challenged me most in my life. And here's what Beck says in Unclean. He says, disgust is a prerequisite to love. To be love requires a backdrop of disgust. So the only way you can really love someone is first you have to be disgusted by that. And I know that sounds weird, but think about it this way. I remember when my kids were little, like babies in diapers. And if you've ever been a parent with a kid in diapers or been around kids, every now and then kids have a blowout, right? Which is where they just have gross diarrhea and it comes out of and it's all over everything. Or I remember my kids would throw up sometimes. I remember one time my son just projectile vomited, like pureed orange carrots all over my wife, all over the table, all over the bathroom. It's disgusting. But as a parent, when you look down on your kid and they're there like covered in vomit or they're there covered in diarrhea, it's gross, it's disgusting. But what do you do as a parent? You reach down and you pick them up and you pull them close. And you can just feel the disgustingness as it gets all over you. And you're just thinking, I'm going to have to shower and bathe in like rubbing alcohol for 3 days. And it's like, on one hand, it's disgusting because it is. But on the other hand, it's, yeah, but this is my baby. See, this is what Beck is getting at. The only way you truly know you love someone is if in the middle of what appears disgusting, you still choose to love. See, in order for love to really be love, there has to be that kind of background of, yeah, but there's this ugly part, and there's this gross part, and there's this disgusting part. See, the reason that some of us struggle with feeling loved as people is because when we look at ourselves, what we see is disgust. We look at ourselves and we see all the things we have done in our life. We see, well, I did this and I did that, and there's this mistake and that mistake. And when we look in the mirror, quite honestly, we're disgusted by ourselves. And so we think, man, how could anyone ever love me? How could God ever love me? Because look at what I have done. But this is where the idea of love and grace and forgiveness is so powerful. And this is what Jesus is getting at in this story. Because in this story, as Jesus talks about the original king, the original master, that's the God character in the story. And Jesus is saying, look, you need to understand, this is how God responds to us as people. That, yeah, we may come before God and we may have all of this baggage. And we may have all of this stuff that we have done wrong. And we may have this huge debt that we could never possibly repay. But what is God's response to us? It's grace. It's forgiveness. It's He reaches down and He picks us up. And He says, I love you. See, the way that we experience forgiveness as people is not by trying to escape our past. It's not by trying to distance ourselves from it. It's by recognizing that even in the middle of that, we are loved. See, legalism is an attempt to cover up our mistakes. Legalism is an attempt to cover up our past. As long as your faith is about trying to prove you're not who you used to be, you will never experience grace and forgiveness. You won't. The only way to experience grace and forgiveness is to own your pain, to own your mistakes, to say, yeah, this was me. I did this. And guess what? I'm still loved. At my grossest, at my worst, at my most disgusting, I am still loved. Some of us, we just need to say that to ourselves over and over again. Maybe you need to go home and look at yourself in the mirror and say, you know what? I'm loved. Say it enough until you believe it, because it's true. That's the whole point of the parable, that even in this man's overwhelming, insurmountable amount of debt, the master looks at him and says, I love you, I forgive you. See, for some of us, that's where it needs to begin. We need to experience that love. We need to stop trying to prove that we're not who we used to be. We need to own the fact that, yeah, I did this, I made this mistake, and guess what? I am still loved. And we need to let that forgiveness flow to us. Others of us need to let that forgiveness flow through us. That maybe there's someone else that we're holding on to something for. And what I want to suggest to you is maybe one of the reasons you can't experience forgiveness in your life is because you're not giving forgiveness. And one of the points of Jesus' parable is you'll never experience forgiveness until you learn to give forgiveness. Now, I'm not saying that you necessarily have to go back and be best friends with that person. I mean, sometimes there are super toxic people that you shouldn't continue to be friends with. But even if that's the case, you still need to forgive them. You need to forgive them so that you can experience freedom. You need to forgive them so that you yourself can experience forgiveness. Because again, forgiveness is a two-way street. It flows to you and it flows through you, but it has to be both ways. It can't be one or the other. See, our transformation as people begins with forgiveness. And it begins with us experiencing forgiveness from God and with us extending that forgiveness to others. And in order for it to work, it has to be both ways.